Hey guys. Tonight let's do the sensible thing. Lower the lights. Put your phone face down. Maybe pretend tomorrow doesn't exist. Because for the next while, we're drifting gently back into the Middle Ages. A time when life was short, explanations were bad, and everyone was deeply confident that whatever was happening to them was absolutely deserved. So settle in. Breathe slowly. Nothing exciting is going to happen here. Just a long, quiet stroll through some of the darkest moments of medieval life, told calmly, mildly sarcastically, and with the understanding that everyone involved was doing their best. Their best just wasn't very good. The Middle Ages didn't feel dark to the people living in them. They felt normal, which is somehow worse. When your baseline expectation of life includes famine, disease, and spiritual guilt, you don't call that an era of suffering. You call that Tuesday. And that's where we'll begin. Let's start with the thing that makes every medieval timeline quietly sigh before collapsing into chaos. Plague. Specifically, the one everyone remembers, fears, and uses as shorthand for divine disappointment. The Black Death. Or, as people living through it would have called it, what on earth is happening and why is everyone dying? The Black Death arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century and immediately made itself comfortable. It didn't knock. It didn't introduce itself. It just showed up, spread everywhere, and refused to leave. Modern historians estimate it wiped out somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population, which is an astonishing number. And also a reminder that medieval record-keeping was mostly vibes and prayers. The disease itself didn't have a single explanation at the time. Germ theory was still several centuries away, and microscopes were not yet part of the medieval imagination. Instead, people got creative. Very creative. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed planetary alignment. A solid number blamed God, which was always a safe option. And of course there were accusations against minorities, foreigners, and basically anyone who was already unpopular. Because when things go wrong, humanity loves consistency. Cities emptied. Villages vanished. Entire family lines simply stopped. Not with drama, not with closure, but quietly. One day there were people. Then there weren't. And the living were left trying to explain why. Doctors wore those now famous beaked masks, filled with herbs meant to filter out the bad air. Which didn't work, but did give them the unsettling appearance of exhausted plague birds wandering the streets. It was less medicine and more medieval cosplay, but everyone involved was sincere. The church tried to respond, of course. Some clergy stayed and ministered to the sick, often dying alongside them. Others quietly relocated. Spiritual authority is easier to maintain when you're not actively coughing. Even the Pope at the time, Pope Clement VI, reportedly isolated himself and sat between two fires, hoping the heat would purify the air. Did not. But again, effort was made. And while the plague tore through cities, the countryside didn't get off easy either. Because just before all this, Europe had already been dealing with something else. Hunger. Not the poetic kind. The grinding, slow, administrative kind. The Great Famine of the early 14th century hit before the plague, weakening populations and setting the stage for disaster. Years of cold, wet weather ruined crops. Grain rotted in the fields. Livestock died. Prices skyrocketed. And medieval economies, being what they were, had no meaningful way to absorb shock. Peasants ate whatever they could. Wood, grass. In extreme cases, things that were technically not food. Chroniclers wrote about desperation in flat, factual tones, as if listing ingredients, which tells you how common it was. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. So when the plague arrived, it found a population already exhausted. It didn't have to work hard, just continued. And this is one of the strangest things about the Middle Ages. The disasters didn't arrive one at a time. They overlap. They piled up. There was no recovery period. Just a constant sense that something else was about to go wrong and probably would. Meanwhile, the people at the top of society were not immune to this chaos. They just experienced it differently. Kings lost heirs. Noble families vanished. Titles passed unexpectedly. Succession crises appeared out of nowhere because the person who was supposed to rule next simply didn't survive the winter. And yet, the machinery of power kept moving. Taxes were still demanded. Wars were still planned. Ceremonies still happened, sometimes with noticeably fewer attendees. Which brings us gently to another dark feature of medieval life. Not a single event but a long, slow pattern. The quiet suffering of children born into royal and noble families. Being born a prince or princess in the Middle Ages did not mean comfort. It meant expectation. It meant fragile health, questionable medicine, and parents who were often strangers. Infant mortality was high across all classes, but noble children had the special experience of having their deaths recorded in beautiful handwriting. Many royal children were sickly. Chronic illnesses, developmental issues, and mysterious conditions were common. Part of this was environment. Part of it was nutrition. And part of it was the increasingly creative family trees of European nobility, which tended to loop back on themselves like a confused labyrinth. Marriages were arranged for power, not genetic diversity. Cousins married cousins, sometimes closer than that. The goal was consolidation. The side effect was a collection of heirs who looked exhausted from birth. And yet expectations never softened. A child prince was expected to rule, lead armies, and produce heirs of his own, all while surviving illnesses that modern medicine would treat with a single prescription and a glass of water. If he failed, history rarely lingered. A line in a chronicle. Date. And then on to the next one. Let's float gently now from sickness and hunger to something more abstract. Fear. Not the sudden kind. The slow, ever-present fear that your soul was in constant danger. Medieval Christianity emphasized sin, judgment, and the afterlife. And while faith provided comfort for many, it also created a background hum of anxiety. Every misfortune could be interpreted as punishment. Every disaster was a message. And nobody was entirely sure what the message said. This led to movements of extreme piety. Flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves publicly in an attempt to atone for humanity's sins. They believed that if enough suffering was offered voluntarily, God might stop the involuntary kind. The church was not always enthusiastic about this. Independent religious movements tended to make authorities nervous. Organized guilt was one thing. Freelance guilt was another. Still, these processions tell us something important. People were desperate for meaning. They wanted to believe there was a reason behind the chaos. That someone was in control. Even if that control was deeply unhappy with them. And then there were the persecutions. The need to assign blame when explanations failed. Minority communities, especially Jewish populations across Europe, were accused of causing the plague. Entire communities were destroyed based on rumor, fear, and the comforting illusion that violence could restore order. These events weren't always sanctioned officially. Sometimes they were tolerated. Sometimes they were quietly ignored. Sometimes they were encouraged. The records vary, but the pattern remains the same. When societies panic, cruelty becomes procedural. And all of this existed alongside daily life. People still married. Children were still born. Markets still opened. Life didn't stop because it couldn't. Just became narrower. Smaller. Focused on survival. The darkest thing about the Middle Ages isn't any single catastrophe. It's the endurance. The way people adapted to loss so thoroughly that it became invisible. Death was familiar. Grief was private. Hope was cautious. And yet people continued. They rebuilt towns. They wrote letters. They prayed. They complained about taxes. They laughed occasionally. History doesn't always record that part, but it was there. As we drift toward the end of this first stretch, keep that in mind. The Middle Ages weren't defined by darkness alone. They were defined by persistence within it. A long, quiet refusal to stop existing, even when existence was deeply inconvenient. In the next part, we'll ease into the lives of specific rulers. Kings and queens who inherited this world of instability and somehow managed to make it more stressful. 'Cause of course they did. For now, just rest here. Let the plague fade into the background, the hunger soften into memory, and allow the medieval night to stretch on, slow and unbothered by your presence. Part 2, Kings, Curses, and the Inconvenience of Being Alive. Alright, let's keep drifting. The lights are still low. The world outside is politely ignored. And we're staying right here in the Middle Ages where the candles flicker, the walls sweat a little, and the people in charge are not coping. Because if there's one thing the darkest events of the medieval period love to do, it's attach themselves to rulers. Kings and queens were not just political figures. They were walking symbols. Things went well, God approved. Things went badly, well, God was clearly furious and also very specific. So let's gently float toward a man who had the unfortunate experience of ruling England during one of its least cooperative centuries. A king remembered less for what he did, and more for what kept happening to him. Henry VI of England. Henry VI became king as an infant, which is never ideal. He inherited the throne before he could walk, speak, or understand why adults were yelling. England at the time was already tired. Tired of war. Tired of taxes. Tired of France. And Henry was not the man for the job. He grew into a gentle, deeply pious ruler who preferred prayer to politics. Which sounds nice. Just wasn't useful. He struggled with decision-making, avoided confrontation, and appeared genuinely confused by the idea that ruling required assertiveness. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Henry experienced what modern historians describe as a severe mental breakdown. He became unresponsive for long periods. He didn't recognize people. He couldn't speak or react. England effectively had a king-shaped absence on the throne. This wasn't treated with compassion, or therapy, or rest. It was treated with panic. Because kings weren't allowed to be unwell in ways that disrupted governance. Illness in a ruler didn't inspire sympathy. It inspired power grabs. And that's exactly what happened. Henry's condition helped trigger the Wars of the Roses. A long, grinding conflict between rival noble houses, both convinced they had a better claim to the throne. The country descended into decades of instability, violence, and shifting loyalties. And Henry himself drifted through it all like a ghost. Crowned, deposed, reinstated, imprisoned. He spent his final years quietly locked away, eventually dying under suspicious circumstances. Which, in medieval England, was practically a retirement plan. The darkness here isn't just the war. It's the fact that a man clearly unwell was placed at the center of a national crisis and expected to function anyway. When he couldn't, the system didn't adapt. Collapsed outward. Let's float now across the channel, where things were not better, just differently stressful. France had its own troubled king. One whose nickname alone tells you how this is going to go. Charles VI of France. Often remembered as Charles the Mad. Which, again, is not a gentle title. Charles VI began his reign with promise. Young, handsome, energetic, the kind of king people like projecting hope onto. And then, in his 20s, something changed. Charles began experiencing violent episodes of mental illness. He believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. He failed to recognize his wife. He attacked his own knights during a paranoid episode. These were not subtle symptoms. And just like in England, the response wasn't care. It was containment and manipulation. Power shifted to factions around him. Regents, relatives, advisors, everyone insisting they knew what was best for the king, and for France. The country slid into internal conflict while Charles drifted in and out of lucidity. At one point, his condition became so severe that he had to be restrained to prevent self-harm. Medieval restraint, which was not designed with comfort in mind. And yet, ceremonially, he remained king. Documents were signed in his name. Orders were issued under his authority. His illness became a political tool. When he was lucid, people tried to control him. When he wasn't, they acted without him. France suffered immensely during this period. Not just from internal division, but from renewed conflict with England. The 100 Years' War dragged on, draining resources and morale. The darkness here is quiet and bureaucratic. A nation ruled by someone who couldn't rule, surrounded by people who shouldn't. And then there's the Holy Roman Empire. A political entity that was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire in any modern sense. Just a loose collection of territories, titles, and family grudges wearing a crown. One of its most infamous rulers was Henry IV. A man whose reign was defined by conflict with the Church. Specifically with the Pope. Because medieval politics loved a dramatic rivalry. Henry IV spent much of his life locked in a power struggle over who had the authority to appoint bishops. The emperor or the pope. This disagreement escalated into excommunication, which, at the time, was not just a spiritual slap. It was a political disaster. Being excommunicated meant your subjects were released from loyalty to you. It meant rebellion, instability, and awkward dinners. In one of the most famous moments of medieval humiliation, Henry crossed the Alps in winter to seek forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII. He stood barefoot in the snow for days, waiting to be absolved. King. In the snow. Barefoot. Reflecting on his life choices. He was eventually forgiven. Temporarily. The conflict resumed later. 'Cause of course it did. Henry's reign was filled with rebellion, family betrayal, and civil war. His own son eventually turned against him, forcing his abdication. Henry died isolated and bitter, denied burial in consecrated ground for years. This wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a long erosion. Authority slipping away piece by piece, until nothing was left but a title and regret. And that's something you see again and again in medieval darkness. Not sudden endings, just slow declines. Let's drift now to another ruler whose reign coincided with catastrophe, but who managed to add his own flavor of misery. Richard II of England. Richard became king as a child, during a time of social upheaval. The peasants' revolt erupted early in his reign, driven by economic pressure and resentment toward the ruling class. Richard famously met the rebels in person and promised reforms. He did not keep them. As he grew older, Richard became increasingly authoritarian. He surrounded himself with favorites. He punished dissent harshly. He believed deeply in the divine right of kings, especially his own. This did not endear him to the nobility. Eventually, he was overthrown by his cousin, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned and likely starved to death. Quietly, away from ceremony. Another king reduced to an administrative problem. What makes Richard's story dark isn't just his end. It's the pattern. Child rulers. Trauma. Power without preparation. Expectations without support. The Middle Ages produced many rulers who never had a chance to be anything else. They were shaped by fear, isolation, and constant pressure to perform legitimacy. And beneath them, ordinary people continued to suffer. Wars destroyed farmland. Armies looted villages. Taxation increased to fund conflicts that offered no benefit to those paying. Justice was inconsistent. Protection was conditional. And still people endured. They told stories. They sang songs. They built cathedrals over generations they knew they wouldn't live to see finished. Which is maybe the strangest comfort of all. As we let this part wind down, notice how the darkest events of the Middle Ages aren't just disasters. They're systems failing people repeatedly, without apology. In the next part, we'll drift further into dynasties that seemed cursed from birth. Families where illness, obsession, and inheritance collided over and over again, as if history was gently tapping the same bruise. For now, stay still. Let the kings fade into shadow. Let the crowns rest heavy and unused. The night is long, and the Middle Ages are in no hurry. Part 3. Dynasties that should have stopped reproducing. Alright, let's keep going. Nothing abrupt. Nothing loud. Just a slow, careful drift deeper into the medieval family album. The one where everyone looks tired, mildly ill, and strangely related to one another in ways no one wanted to think about too hard. Because if the Middle Ages had a recurring problem, aside from famine, disease, and spiritual dread, it was dynasties. Long-running royal families that believed, with absolute confidence, that the solution to every political problem was another marriage to a cousin, or an uncle, or someone who shared a suspicious number of great-grandparents. And naturally, this worked perfectly. Until it didn't. Let's begin with a family that quietly dominates medieval European misery. The Capetians of France. On paper they were successful. They ruled for centuries. The crown stayed in the family. Stability more or less. In reality, the later Capetians had a habit of producing kings who were fragile. Physically, emotionally, and occasionally both at once. Take Louis X of France, known as Louis the Quarrelsome, which is already not ideal. He ruled for less than 2 years. He was constantly at odds with the nobility, deeply unpopular, and died suddenly at the age of 26. The official cause of death was illness, possibly pneumonia, possibly exhaustion, possibly poisoning, depending on which chronicler you believe and how dramatic they were feeling that day. Louis left behind a pregnant wife. Everyone waited. The kingdom held its breath. And when the child was born, a son, he lived for 5 days. And then died. The Cape Town direct mail line ended not with a bang, but with a deeply awkward pause and a funeral for an infant king, which triggered a succession crisis that rippled across France and beyond. This wasn't shocking to medieval observers. It was accepted, almost expected. Royal children died often. The darkness here is how normal it felt. And France wasn't alone. Let's drift east, toward the Holy Roman Empire again, because it simply refuses to be left out of anything unpleasant. The Hohenstaufen dynasty produced ambitious rulers with impressive titles and deeply stressful lives. One of the most striking was Frederick II. Frederick II was brilliant, multilingual, educated, interested in science, philosophy, and falconry. He was also widely suspected of being the Antichrist, which really balanced things out. He ruled over a fragmented empire and spent much of his life fighting the papacy. He was excommunicated multiple times, which, at that point, was less a punishment and more a recurring theme. Frederick's court was unusual for the Middle Ages. It included scholars from different religious backgrounds. He encouraged intellectual exchange. He questioned tradition. And this terrified everyone. The darkness in Frederick's life wasn't just political. It was personal. His children died young. His marriages were political and cold. His legacy was contested and dismantled almost immediately after his death. His dynasty collapsed within a generation. The empire fractured that had depended on his force of personality simply deflated. Medieval systems were often held together by individuals. When those individuals disappeared, everything went with them. Now let's ease into a family that perfected the art of slow genetic decline. The Habsburgs. Not at their peak yet. Not with a famous jaw. But already laying the groundwork. In the late Middle Ages, the Habsburgs began consolidating power through marriage. Carefully. Strategically. Repetitively. One of their early figures, Albert II of Germany, inherited multiple titles and responsibilities. He ruled briefly and died young, likely from illness contracted during a military campaign. His son, Ladislaus the Posthumous, never met him. Ladislaus inherited crowns before he could speak. He was shuffled between regents, advisors, and power-hungry relatives. He died suddenly at 17. Poisoning was suspected. Naturally, the pattern was forming. Short reigns, early deaths, children raised as political objects rather than people. The Middle Ages didn't see this as cruelty. It saw it as necessity. Which brings us gently to another dark thread woven through medieval life. Childhood itself. For most medieval children, royal or peasant, childhood was brief. Expectations arrived early. Labor followed soon after. And for noble children, education was mixed with separation. Sons sent to be raised in other courts. Daughters prepared for marriage before adolescence had finished unpacking. Affection existed, but it was cautious. Loving a child too openly was risky when survival was uncertain. Emotional distance became a kind of armor. And when children died, parents mourned quietly. Or not at all, at least in writing. Chroniclers recorded births and deaths with the same tone. Neutral. Factual. As if emotion would interfere with the ink. Now let's float toward a darker, quieter tragedy. One that didn't involve crowns or dynasties, but affected millions. Medieval justice. Justice in the Middle Ages was not consistent. It was local, customary, often public, and deeply symbolic. Punishments were designed to be seen. Pillories. Public humiliation. Not always violent, but rarely gentle. Crime was broadly defined. Blasphemy. Heresy. Social deviation. And trials were often less about evidence and more about reputation. If you were poor, foreign, or already disliked, guilt was easier to establish. The most unsettling part is how ordinary this was. Justice was entertainment, lesson, a reminder of order. And when combined with religious fear, it became something else entirely. Accusations of heresy, especially in the later Middle Ages, could destroy entire communities. People were interrogated, confessions extracted, beliefs scrutinized. The goal wasn't always punishment. It was conformity. This wasn't hysteria in the modern sense. It was systemic anxiety. A society afraid of spiritual contamination, trying desperately to control invisible threats. And that fear seeped into everything. Medicine. politics, family life, even grief. People didn't process trauma the way we do now. There was no framework for mental health. No language for depression or anxiety. Melancholy existed, but it was moralized. Sadness was a spiritual failing. Illness of the mind was often seen as illness of the soul. So people endured quietly, or broke, or became saints, or became warnings. And through all of it, time moved slowly. Years were marked by feast days, harvests, wars, and deaths. Calendars were religious. History was cyclical. The idea of progress was distant and abstract. The darkest events of the Middle Ages weren't anomalies. They were rhythms. Plague returned. War resumed. Dynasties collapsed and reformed. Children were born into expectations they didn't ask for. And yet the world continued. People still believed in beauty, in art, in faith, in meaning. They carved stone knowing they wouldn't see the result. They copied manuscripts by hand. They sang songs we no longer remember. Which makes the darkness heavier, not lighter. Because it wasn't emptiness. It was fullness under strain. As we let this part gently come to rest, notice how the tragedies aren't explosive. They're cumulative. A long accumulation of loss, normalized until it feels inevitable. In the next part we'll drift toward queens. Women whose lives were shaped by marriage, fertility, and political expectation. Some powerful, some invisible, most exhausted. For now, stay where you are. Let the dynasties fade into one another. Names repeating, faces blurring, history breathing slowly in the dark. We'll continue when you're ready. Part 4. Queens, wombs, and the long wait for an heir. Alright, let's continue. Nothing changes suddenly here. The candles are still low. The air is still heavy with incense and poor ventilation. And now, very gently, we shift our attention away from crowns and titles and toward the people who were expected to produce them. Queens. Not the fairy tale kind. Not the glowing romantic figures painted centuries later. These queens were political infrastructure, walking treaties, mobile bloodlines. And their value was measured in one primary unit. Children. Preferably male. Ideally alive. Let's begin with a woman whose life reads less like a biography and more like a waiting room. Isabella of France. Often remembered as the she-wolf of France. Which is a lot. Especially considering how long she spent being ignored. Isabella was married off to the English King Edward II. And this marriage was doomed from the start. Edward showed little interest in Isabella and considerably more interest in his male favorites. Very publicly, very unapologetically. Isabella's role was clear. Produce an heir. Smile politely. Accept neglect. And she did. For a while. She gave birth to children, including a son who would become Edward III. But her personal position at court remained weak. She was isolated, humiliated, and sidelined while Edward's favorites accumulated power and wealth. The darkness here isn't scandal. It's inertia. Years of quiet disregard. Of being present but irrelevant. Eventually, Isabella snapped. Only. Strategically. She allied herself with a disaffected nobleman, invaded England, overthrew her husband, and ruled as regent for her son. Edward II was imprisoned and later died under circumstances that historians still argue about. Isabella's reputation never recovered. A woman who tolerated neglect was invisible. A woman who acted was monstrous. That pattern will feel familiar. Let's float now toward a queen who barely had time to understand what was happening to her. Margaret of Norway. Margaret was never crowned. She never ruled. She was a child, declared Queen of Scotland at the age of 3. She lived in Norway, far from the country she technically governed. Plans were made. Treaties drafted. A future marriage arranged to secure peace between Scotland and England. Margaret died at 7 years old. Possibly from illness. Possibly from the stress of travel. Possibly from nothing anyone could identify. Her death triggered a Scottish succession crisis that led to years of conflict and eventually English intervention. Child died. A kingdom destabilized. This is medieval darkness at its quietest. No villain. No conspiracy. Just a small body and enormous consequences. Now let's settle into a longer, heavier story. One defined by endurance rather than action. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor lived an unusually long life for the Middle Ages, which meant she experienced nearly every possible role available to a medieval woman of her status. Duchess in her own right. Queen of France. Queen of England. Mother of kings. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was unhappy. They went on crusade together, which was not romantic. It was exhausting, dangerous, and deeply awkward. Their marriage ended in annulment after producing only daughters. No male heir. Which, in medieval logic, made the marriage spiritually inconvenient. Eleanor remarried quickly. To Henry II of England. A man who was energetic, controlling, and almost constantly unfaithful. She gave him many children. Sons who would later rebel against him. Daughters who would be married off across Europe. And when Eleanor herself rebelled, supporting her sons against Henry, she was imprisoned. For 16 years. 16. Not in a dungeon exactly, but under constant supervision. Moved between castles. Allowed appearances when politically useful. Her punishment wasn't physical suffering. It was removal. Being sidelined while history moved on without her. And yet she outlived Henry. She returned to power. She governed. She arranged marriages. She became something like a living archive of dynastic memory. Eleanor's darkness wasn't tragedy. It was containment. Now let's drift toward a queen whose entire life was defined by pregnancy and disappointment. Anne of Bohemia. Anne married Richard II of England. Their marriage was reportedly affectionate, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. But Anne never produced an heir. This was not taken lightly. She was blamed, quietly at first, then more openly. Infertility in queens was always assumed to be the woman's fault. Medical understanding was limited. Sympathy even more so. Anne died of illness in her late 20s. Richard was devastated. He ordered harsh reprisals against the town where she died because of minor delays in burial arrangements. Grief, when mixed with absolute power, rarely looks graceful. Without an heir, Richard's reign became unstable. His eventual deposition followed. Again, a personal loss rippling outward into national collapse. Now let's pause briefly and look at the shared shape of these lives. Queens were expected to endure. Silence was virtue. Fertility was currency. Obedience was safety. Failure, real or perceived, was remembered forever. And when queens did act decisively, history often reframed them as unnatural. Manipulative. Dangerous. The darkness here isn't cruelty alone. It's expectation without support. Responsibility without authority. Queens were central to medieval politics, but rarely allowed control over it. They bore the physical risks of childbirth, the emotional weight of dynastic survival, and the public blame when things went wrong. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Painful, unpredictable. Many queens died young in labor. Others survived repeated pregnancies that weakened their bodies over time. Still, they were expected to continue. There was no retirement, no pause. And when a queen died, the machinery moved on. Another marriage arranged. Another woman installed. Another cycle begins. As this part settles, let the lives of these women blur together. Different names, similar expectations, quiet endurance under enormous pressure. In the next part, we'll drift toward belief itself. Crusades, holy wars, and the strange calm with which people justified suffering in the name of God. For now, rest here. The queens fade into shadow. The corridors grow quiet again. And the Middle Ages continue their slow, unhurried breath. Part 5. God willed it, apparently. Alright. Still here. The night hasn't moved much. The Middle Ages certainly haven't learned anything. And now, very gently, we drift toward belief. Not the comforting kind. Not the quiet prayers whispered before sleep. But belief as policy. Belief as justification. Belief as a reason to walk thousands of miles, starve politely, and die very far from home. We're talking about crusades. The medieval world did not separate religion from politics, or war, or daily life. God wasn't a private concept. God was management. And when things went wrong, which they constantly did, the response was often to do something extremely dramatic and call it holy. The First Crusade was launched at the end of the 11th century after a speech by Pope Urban II. The message was simple. The Holy Land was under threat. Christian pilgrims were unsafe. God wanted action. The crowd reportedly responded with the phrase, Deus vult. God wills it, which is a very efficient phrase. It answers questions before they're asked. Thousands of people took this seriously. Not just knights and nobles, but peasants, townsfolk, and people who had never traveled more than a few miles from home. They sold belongings. They abandoned farms. They joined a movement fueled by faith, fear, and a vague sense that this would somehow fix things. Did not. The journey itself was brutal. Long marches, limited supplies, disease, violence against local populations along the way. Many crusaders never reached their destination. They died quietly, unnamed, on roadsides far from the holy city they were promised. Those who did arrive found something else waiting. Siege warfare, starvation, desperation. When Jerusalem was captured in 1099, chroniclers describe mass slaughter. Not with horror, with satisfaction. Victory was measured in bodies. Blood was interpreted as purification. This wasn't an aberration. It was ideology functioning as intended. And then, it kept happening. Crusades weren't a single event. They were a recurring solution. If something went wrong, politically, spiritually, economically, the answer could always be another crusade. Lost territory. Crusade. Internal dissent. Crusade. Too many restless nobles. Definitely crusade. Let's float toward one of the most surreal episodes in this long series. The Children's Crusade. Or rather, what later writers called the Children's Crusade. In the early 13th century, groups of young people, some children, some adolescents, some simply poor, set out for the Holy Land believing God would part the sea for them. Literally, they believed faith would replace ships. Did not. Many died. Many were sold into slavery. Many simply vanished from the record. Modern historians debate what exactly happened, but the darkness here isn't the logistics. It's the belief that innocence could substitute preparation, that purity could replace planning. Adults allowed this, encouraged it, or at least failed to stop it. Faith had become momentum. Now let's drift into a different kind of holy war. One that didn't involve distant lands, but neighbors. The Albigensian Crusade. In southern France, a religious group known as the Cathars held beliefs that differed from mainstream Catholic doctrine. They were labeled heretical. And in medieval Christendom, heresy was not something you debated. It was something you erased. A crusade was launched against them in the early 13th century. Not against foreign enemies. Against fellow Christians. Towns were besieged. Civilians killed indiscriminately. When asked how to tell heretics from the faithful, one commander reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." This may or may not be an exact quote, but it perfectly captures the mood. Belief became a blunt instrument. Precision was unnecessary. Certainty was enough. And this wasn't limited to crusades. Let's drift gently into the world of medieval punishment for spiritual deviation. Heresy trials. Inquisitions. The medieval Inquisition wasn't a single institution. It varied by region and time. But the principle was consistent. Wrong belief was dangerous. Not just to the individual soul, but to the entire community. Suspected heretics were questioned. Confessions were encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The goal wasn't always execution. Often it was repentance, public confession, reintegration. But the process itself was heavy, fear-based, isolating. And once accused, it was difficult to escape suspicion. Neighbors watched each other. Words were chosen carefully. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. This created a culture of quiet compliance, of inward belief and outward conformity. Which brings us to another group who lived under constant suspicion. Jewish communities across medieval Europe. They were essential to the economy in many places, often serving as moneylenders due to Christian prohibitions on usury. This made them both useful and resented. During times of crisis, plague, famine, war, resentment turned lethal. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, spreading disease, conspiring with enemies. None of this was true. All of it was believed. Massacres occurred. Expulsions followed. Entire communities were erased or forced to migrate. And then, when the economy suffered due to their absence, rulers quietly invited them back. Until the next crisis. This cycle repeated for centuries. The darkness here isn't ignorance. It's convenience. Blame was easier than understanding. Now let's rest briefly with the idea of medieval salvation. Heaven. Oh. Purgatory. Purgatory was particularly stressful. It was a relatively new concept in the Middle Ages. A place where souls went to be purified before entering heaven. Not eternal punishment, just prolonged discomfort. And this mattered because it meant the living could help the dead. Through prayers, donations, masses, this created an entire spiritual economy. People paid to reduce suffering after death. Wealthy families endowed churches to pray for their souls indefinitely. Poor people hoped. Death wasn't the end. It was a transition into another bureaucratic system. Fear of damnation shaped behavior. It encouraged generosity, yes, but also anxiety, obsession, scrupulosity. People worried about dying suddenly without confession, about forgetting a sin, about being punished forever for something they couldn't remember doing. And clergy were the intermediaries, sometimes compassionate, sometimes exploitative, often both. Which brings us to the clergy themselves. Monks, priests, bishops. People who were supposed to embody spiritual calm. Many did. Many didn't. Some clergy lived ascetic lives of discipline and service. Others accumulated wealth, power, and mistresses. Corruption was not universal, but it was visible enough to be commented on even at the time. And yet the institution endured. Because it offered structure, meaning, answers. In a world where life was unpredictable and often short, certainty was comforting, even when it was terrifying. The darkest events of the Middle Ages tied to belief aren't about faith itself. They're about certainty without humility, conviction without restraint. People believed deeply, and they acted on that belief with the tools available to them, which were often sharp. As we let this part settle, notice how calm all of this feels from a distance. Crusades, massacres, trials, all absorbed into the slow rhythm of history. For the people living through it, it wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was immediate. But they adapted. They normalized. They kept going. In the next part, we'll drift toward the end of things. The slow unraveling of the medieval world as plague returns, faith fractures, and certainty begins to crack. For now, stay still. Prayers fade. The banners lower. And the Middle Ages, deeply convinced of themselves, continue into the dark. Part 6. When the world started to come apart quietly. Alright, let's keep going. Nothing dramatic happens here. No trumpet sounds. No official announcement that the Middle Ages are winding down. History almost never does that. Instead, things just start to loosen. Certainties soften. Systems creak. People notice that the answers they've relied on for centuries are no longer working as advertised. And that realization settles in slowly. Like damn. One of the strangest things about the late Middle Ages is how familiar the disasters felt by this point. Plague returned. Again. And again. Not always as devastating as the first time, but frequent enough to remind everyone that safety was temporary. The Black Death didn't leave Europe after the 14th century. It became seasonal, regional, background threat. Towns learned to expect it, to quarantine, close gates, to ring bells. People adapted, which is somehow unsettling. Entire professions existed around death. Gravediggers, bell ringers, professional mourners. Death was no longer a singular tragedy. It was a cycle. And the church, which had once offered certainty, began to show cracks. Clergy had died in massive numbers during the first wave of plague. Replacements were rushed. Training suffered. Standards slipped. People noticed. Some priests fled during outbreaks. Others stayed and died. The inconsistency mattered. Faith remained, but trust weakened. And then there was money. Church institutions had accumulated enormous wealth over centuries. Land. Donations meant to shorten time in purgatory. This had always been visible, but now it felt heavier. Especially when paired with suffering. Which brings us gently to a moment that didn't feel world-ending at the time, but absolutely was. The Avignon Papacy. For nearly 70 years, the papacy relocated from Rome to Avignon, in modern-day France. The Pope lived under the influence of the French crown. Politics crept visibly into the spiritual center of Europe. And when the papacy eventually returned to Rome, things did not stabilize. Instead, there were multiple popes, rival claimants, competing lines of authority. The Great Western Schism. Christendom, which relied on the idea of a single spiritual leader, suddenly had options. This was not ideal. Ordinary people didn't debate theology. They noticed confusion. They noticed that the church couldn't agree with itself. And that was new. One of the loudest voices pointing this out belonged to John Wycliffe. He criticized church wealth, clerical corruption, and the idea that spiritual authority required elaborate hierarchy. His ideas spread quietly, through students, through texts, through people who were already uneasy. Wycliffe didn't start a reformation, But he loosened something. And once loosened, it didn't tighten again. Not far away in Bohemia, another figure picked up similar ideas. Huss preached in the local language. He criticized church corruption. He emphasized moral authority over institutional power. He was summoned to a council under a promise of safe conduct. He was arrested anyway, tried for heresy, burned at the stake. This was meant to restore order. Instead, it inspired rebellion. The Hussite wars followed. Religious conflict erupted within Central Europe. Faith fractured not between religions, but within one. And once belief fractured, control weakened. Let's drift now toward everyday people again. Because while kings, popes, and reformers argued, peasants noticed something else. They were still poor, still taxed, still expected to obey. But after plague had wiped out so much of the population, labor was suddenly valuable. This changed things. Peasants began demanding wages, better conditions, freedom of movement. Lords resisted. This led to revolts. Not constant, not coordinated, but enough to matter. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is one of the most famous. Sparked by taxes and inequality, fueled by frustration. The rebels marched on London. They demanded reforms. For a moment it looked like something might change. Didn't. The revolt was crushed. Leaders were executed. Promises were withdrawn. But the idea remained. People had asked loud. That didn't go away. Now let's rest briefly with the concept of medieval time. For centuries, life had been structured by religious calendars, feast days, cycles of fasting and celebration. But trade was expanding. Cities were growing. Money mattered more. Mechanical clocks began appearing in town squares. Time became measured, scheduled, external. This seems small. It wasn't. When time is owned by the church, it's sacred. When time is owned by the town, it's practical. That shift mattered. So did literacy. More people could read. Not everyone, but more than before. Ideas traveled faster. Criticism spread wider. The monopoly on knowledge weakened. And through all of this, the old medieval certainty that God actively managed daily events began to feel distant. Faith didn't disappear, just changed shape. People prayed, but they also questioned. They hedged. The darkness of the late Middle Ages isn't collapse. It's uncertainty. A sense that the structures holding the world together were still standing, but no longer unquestionable. And that's deeply uncomfortable. As this part begins to settle, notice how nothing dramatic has happened. No single disaster. No final blow. Just erosion. The plague became familiar. Authority became negotiable. Belief became personal. The Middle Ages didn't end with a scream. They ended with a shrug. In the next part, we'll drift toward the final shadows. The last medieval fears. The transition into something else, whether people wanted it or not. For now, rest here. The bells ring softer. The answers feel less certain. And history quietly prepares to turn the page. Part 7. The long goodbye nobody noticed. All right. Still with me. By now, the Middle Ages are very tired. Not collapsing. Not panicking. Just worn down. Like a structure that's technically standing, but no one's quite sure how much longer the beams will hold. And the people living through this time didn't know they were approaching an ending. They never do. They thought this was just how things were now. Slightly worse than before. Slightly less certain. A little louder with arguments and a little quieter with faith. Which makes this final stretch especially gentle. And especially dark. Let's begin with death again. Because medieval history always circles back. Plague outbreaks continued well into the 15th century. Smaller than before. More localized. But frequent enough to keep fear alive. Towns developed rules. Quarantines. Isolation periods. Travel restrictions. And people obeyed them. Mostly. Not because they trusted science. But because experience had taught them that proximity meant risk. Funerals became smaller. Burials quicker. Mourning more private. And with death constantly nearby, people began to think differently about life. Art changed. Late medieval art became more focused on suffering. On realism. On the physicality of death. Skeletons appeared in murals. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a common theme. Kings and peasants danced together, equally fragile. This wasn't rebellion. It was acknowledgement. Death was the great equalizer. And medieval people were finally comfortable admitting that. Now let's drift into fear of another kind. Fear of women. Specifically, fear of women who didn't fit neatly into expected roles. Widows with property. Healers. Midwives. Elderly women without families. In earlier centuries, these figures existed quietly on the margins. But in the late Middle Ages, anxiety sharpened. Misfortune needed explanation. And invisible threats were always the most frightening. Witchcraft accusations began to increase toward the end of the medieval period. Not yet at their early modern peak, but unmistakably rising. Women were accused of causing illness, crop failure, impotence, sudden death. None of this was new. But now it was systematized. Manuals were written. Procedures outlined. Suspicion became policy. The darkness here isn't hysteria. It's bureaucracy. Fear with paperwork. And while most accusations didn't end in execution yet, the groundwork was laid. People were learning how to blame. Now let's float gently toward the people who were supposed to protect society from all of this. Kings. Late medieval kings ruled over populations that were harder to control. More urban. More literate. More aware of alternatives. Authority had to be asserted more loudly. Taxes increased. Armies professionalized. Violence became less seasonal and more constant. Or shifted. The medieval knight, armored and noble, began to fade. Infantry mattered more. Gunpowder weapons appeared. Castles were no longer invincible. This unsettled everyone. Because medieval society was built on hierarchy. And hierarchy depended on predictability. When a peasant with a firearm could kill a knight, something fundamental broke. Let's drift briefly to a man who existed right at this boundary. Charles the Bold. Charles dreamed of restoring old-style chivalric power. Grand armies. Personal glory. Medieval spectacle. He failed. His campaigns ended in disaster. His army was destroyed. His body was found frozen in a ditch, partially eaten by animals. This wasn't a heroic death. It was administrative failure with consequences. The world had changed. He hadn't. And that's the quiet tragedy of the late Middle Ages. People trying to live in a system that no longer fit. Let's drift now to the church again. Because it too was struggling to adapt. Calls for reform grew louder. Not revolution. Just correction. Simplicity. Accountability. But the institution moved slowly. Indulgences became more common. Spiritual benefits sold for money. Officially to fund good works. Unofficially to keep the system running. This wasn't shocking to medieval people. It was familiar. But familiarity doesn't prevent resentment. And resentment accumulates. Now let's settle into the last medieval fear. The end of the world. Apocalyptic thinking flared periodically throughout the Middle Ages. But toward the end it felt closer, more plausible. Wars, plague, schism, moral decay. All signs, some believed, that the final judgment was approaching. People prayed harder, or gave up quietly, or focused on personal salvation rather than collective hope, which again signals a shift. The medieval world was communal. Late medieval life became more individual. Personal piety, personal fear, personal doubt. The system was still there, but belief was becoming private. And that's how eras end. Not with destruction, but with internal retreat. As this part begins to slow, notice how nothing has exploded. No single event ended the Middle Ages. They simply became less convincing. Authority weakened, certainty fractured, fear found new shapes, and people adjusted, as they always do. In the next and final part, we'll gently step over the threshold, not into something brighter, just into something different. For now, stay here. The old world exhales. The structures creak softly, and the Middle Ages, unaware they're being left behind, continue fading into the dark. Part 8. The world that didn't end just changed. Alright, this is the last stretch. No fanfare. No curtain call. The Middle Ages don't bow or announce their departure. They just stop being the only way to understand the world. And people living through it barely notice, because history never feels like history when you're inside it. So let's ease into this ending the same way the era itself did. Slowly, almost apologetically. By the late 15th century, Europe was full of people who still believed in God, still feared death, still respected kings, but not quite in the same unquestioning way their grandparents had. The old certainties were tired. One of the quietest but most disruptive changes arrived in the form of a machine. Not a weapon, not a plague, just a press. Johannes Gutenberg didn't set out to end the Middle Ages. He just wanted to reproduce text more efficiently, which, as it turns out, is how you destabilize entire belief systems. Before printing, books were rare, expensive, copied by hand, controlled by institutions. Knowledge moved slowly and mostly downward. After printing, ideas wandered. Pamphlets circulated. Sermons were written down. Criticism spread without asking permission. This didn't immediately cause rebellion, caused awareness. And awareness is inconvenient. People could compare ideas, spot contradictions, notice patterns. The church was still powerful. Kings still ruled. But the monopoly on interpretation was weakening. And once people realize authority can be questioned, even gently, it never fully recovers. Let's drift back to death one last time. Because even as the world changed, mortality did not. Life expectancy remained low. Child mortality remained high. Medicine was still guessing. But people's relationship with death shifted. The late medieval obsession with judgment softened into something more personal. Confession became introspective. Faith became internal. Heaven and hell were still there. But they felt less immediate, less administratively managed. People worried more about how they lived, not just whether they followed rules. Which brings us to education. Universities expanded. Scholars debated ancient texts. Greek and Roman works were rediscovered, translated, discussed. Not to reject religion but to contextualize it. Humanism didn't erase God. It just put humanity back into the conversation. And that mattered. Now let's pause on kings one final time. Late medieval rulers faced a different kind of challenge. They weren't just managing land and loyalty anymore. They were managing perception. Royal authority had to be justified, explained, performed. Ceremony became more elaborate, law more centralized, bureaucracy expanded, power became impersonal. This reduced chaos but also intimacy. The medieval world was personal. Lords knew peasants. Justice was visible. Authority had a face. The emerging modern world was quieter, paper-driven, procedural, safer maybe, but colder. And people noticed the loss, even if they welcomed the stability. The darkness at the end of the Middle Ages isn't misery. It's nostalgia. For a world that was brutal, unfair, and deeply unequal, but also familiar. A world where everyone understood their place, even if that place was terrible. Change brings anxiety. Always has. As medieval structures faded, people carried their fears forward. Witchcraft accusations intensified. Religious conflict deepened. New wars replaced old ones. The problems didn't vanish. They transformed. Which is why it's tempting to romanticize the Middle Ages, or condemn them outright. But the truth is quieter. They were people doing their best with the tools they had. In a world that explained suffering as meaning and inequality as order. And when those explanations stopped working, they adjusted. Slowly, reluctantly, imperfectly. That's the darkest part, really. Not the plague. Not the wars. Not the executions. It's how normal it all felt. How adaptable humans are to suffering. How quickly horror becomes routine. And yet, how persistent hope remains. They built cathedrals anyway. Raised children anyway. Wrote music anyway. They believed the world mattered, even when it hurt. As we let this final part settle, imagine the medieval night growing quiet. The bells no longer ringing urgently. The fears softening into habit. The Middle Ages don't end here. They just loosen their grip. And somewhere, without realizing it, people begin thinking differently. Questioning gently. Hoping cautiously. History moves on. So for tonight, that's where we'll leave it. Dim the lights a little more. Let the centuries blur together. And remember, every era feels endless until it isn't. Sleep well. The dark is familiar. Part 9, Epilogue, the quiet after. Alright, just a little more. Not because anything new happens, but because endings in history, like sleep, don't arrive on command. They drift in. And sometimes it helps to stay still a moment longer, letting the echoes settle. By this point, the Middle Ages are no longer an era. They're a habit. A way of thinking that lingers even after the structures fade. People don't wake up one morning feeling modern. They wake up tired, a little uncertain, and they keep doing what they've always done, just with slightly different tools. A farmer still rises before dawn. A mother still worries about her children surviving the winter. A ruler still fears rebellion. Priest still worries about souls. None of that disappears. What changes is the explanation. Where suffering was once certain proof of divine intention, it slowly becomes something else. Misfortune. Hence, human failure. Not immediately, not comfortably, but gradually. And that shift is unsettling. Because certainty, even painful certainty, is easier than ambiguity. The medieval world offered answers. They weren't always kind, but they were clear. You suffered because God willed it. You obeyed because order mattered. You endured because endurance was virtue. As those answers weakened, people were left holding questions instead. Why this war? Why this death? Why this child? Why now? Questions don't soothe the way answers do. They hover. They keep you awake. And yet they also open space. Space for change. For reform. For curiosity. For doubt. Which is why the medieval darkness doesn't vanish at the end of the era. It stretches forward. It reshapes itself. Fear becomes ideology. Faith becomes doctrine. Community becomes nation. Obedience becomes law. People don't become better or worse. They become different. And if you look closely, you can still see the Middle Ages in us now. In how we assign blame during crisis. In how we look for meaning in catastrophe. In how quickly we normalize suffering when it becomes familiar. That's the real inheritance. Not castles. Not crowns. Not crusades. But the human ability to live inside difficulty and call it normal. So if this all feels heavy, that's fine. Supposed to. But it's also meant to be calming in a strange way. 'Cause none of this is new. None of it is uniquely ours. People have always struggled. Always adapted. Always kept going. They lay down at night worried about tomorrow. And still slept. So now you can too. Let the centuries blur. Let the names fade. Let the darkness soften into distance. History will keep moving. You don't have to. Good night. Part 10. The thought they took to bed. Alright. Just one last drift. Not because there's more history to tell. There always is. But because medieval nights didn't end cleanly either. People lay awake. Listened to the wind. Counted prayers. Thought about what they'd done wrong. Thought about what tomorrow might take from them. So this part is for that space. The quiet between sleep and worry. By the time the Middle Ages were fully loosening their grip, there were people who sensed something had shifted, even if they couldn't name it. Scholars began talking about the modern world in whispers, usually by contrasting it with what they felt had been lost. One of those voices belonged to Francesco Petrarch. He famously described the centuries before him as a kind of darkness, what we later called the Dark Ages. He believed he was emerging into light, which is interesting, because people living through the Middle Ages rarely felt they were in darkness. They felt burdened, tested, but not lost. Darkness, it turns out, is something we apply afterward. For medieval people, the world made sense because it had structure. God above, kings below. Everyone else arranged neatly in between. Even suffering had a place. What broke wasn't life. It was explanation. And when explanations fracture, people don't immediately replace them. They improvise. They keep the old prayers. They try new ideas. They argue. They double down. They compromise quietly. That's how transitions actually happen. So the last medieval generations lived strangely layered lives. They feared hell but questioned priests. They obeyed kings but resented taxes. They trusted tradition but experimented with change. They were not heroes of progress. They were not villains of stagnation. They were tired people adjusting. And that's why the darkest events of the Middle Ages linger so long in memory. Not because they were uniquely cruel, but because they were endured without the promise of improvement. No progress narrative. No things will get better. Just survival. And yet, things did change. Slowly. Unevenly. Often violently. But they changed. Which means the medieval world wasn't a failure. It was a long rehearsal. Painful one. But human history is full of those. As we finally let this rest, imagine a medieval household at night. The fire is low. The animals are quiet. The walls creak. Someone coughs in the dark. Tomorrow might bring hunger. It might bring illness. It might bring nothing at all. And still they sleep. That's the final thought the Middle Ages leave us with. Not despair. Not triumph. Endurance. So let your mind loosen its grip on the names and dates now. They've done their work. The darkness they belong to is far away. Or here. You're safe. And history for the moment is finished speaking. Good night.